Let no one, let no one feel. And it got me thinking. And it got me thinking.
Okay, welcome to the Energeia podcast, everyone. This is Dr. G, and today I'm thrilled to be here with two of my former colleagues at the Department of Organizational Behavior at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University, Dr. Ronald E. Fry, and the newly minted Dr. Udayandhar. Ron, Udayan, thanks so much for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
First of all, Udayan, congratulations are in order for your recent dissertation defense, that hugest of huge milestones. Ron, you sat on my dissertation committee, and Udayan, you were my first ever TA. Now, those have to be two of the most thankless jobs that have ever existed on Earth. But for those of us who've not had the pleasure of working alongside you both as I have, could you both tell me a little bit about your academic backgrounds, your research interests, and any other relevant scholarly work you've been involved in?
Sure. Again, thanks, Gareth, for having us. I'm Ron Fry, as Gareth said. I'm a fairly long-term faculty member in the Department of Organizational Behavior at Case Western Reserve University. I came here just a few years after we inaugurated the first doctoral program ever in the world in organizational behavior. And it's nice to be here with two of our alums. Makes me very proud. I began my career, I was a Bachelor of Engineering degree from UCLA and did a very short stint in engineering. For whatever reason, I didn't get started in a job that I found very enriching or engaging. And so I went back to grad school and got my master's and PhD at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My early career was mostly concerned with teams and group dynamics. I studied and did a lot of work with executive teams, project teams. My engineering background, I think, helped me relate a lot to technical professionals and the struggles they were having in working in multifunctional project teams and so forth. And then I was part of a group that created the strength-based change methodology called Appreciative Inquiry. And from there, I gained or started getting more interested in system-wide change and how a methodology that's founded on strengths rather than gaps and problems might add to our repertoire of how we could approach change in human systems. And then more recently, that has evolved into studying what we call businesses as agents of world benefit and the notion of positive institutions, institutions that are identified and situated to help and serve a greater good in order to create profits and return for shareholders. Sort of a multi-stakeholder perspective on organizations, but also looking at this question of what is the role of business in society? What can it be? How can it be a more positive factor in societal change?
All right, thank you, Ron and Udayan.
Thank you, Gareth, for having me here. So my name is Udayandhar. I'm from India. I have degrees in electrical engineering, human resource management, and before starting my PhD program here at Case, I worked for about 6 or 7 years, both in quality management, technology, and then in human resources. My research here has been mostly around leadership development, emotional, social intelligence competencies. And I look at all of these things from the perspective of what we call the ideal self, or what is the best possible version of oneself in the future. But my research specifically and my dissertation has been around how the ideal self changes over time, and over a very long-term trajectory, looking at career stages and career development in the long term. But recently, I've also started working at higher levels of analysis. Specifically with Ron, I've been working on how organizations develop that benefit multiple stakeholders. So it's not just shareholders, like Ron said, but also other stakeholders like employees, communities, benefiting the environment within which those companies and organizations operate. So how do such organizations develop? That's been a recent area of inquiry that I've been very interested in.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your potted introductory bios there. We'll get into your collaborative work shortly. But first of all, I mean, it's just definitely great to have some fellow CWR Blue on the show. And Ron, maybe I'll kick things off with you today with my first question. As you mentioned, you're one of the originators of Appreciative Inquiry, along with David Cooperrider, another faculty member there, and an all-round awesome dude in the OB department at CWRU. But before I jump into the main target question I want to get at for you, could you just give us a brief summary of what Appreciative Inquiry is, what this framework is, and how you've applied it in your career?
Sure. Well, I'll try to be brief. The idea of appreciative inquiry is to collectively, with some group of stakeholders that are related to some issue, challenge, or opportunity, to bring them together and to collectively look at what is giving life to that issue already as a starting point. So it's a very different starting point from a traditional problem-solving or gap analysis approach. So the idea is whatever it is that we want to improve or grow or change toward, there's some element of it that's already in existence. What is helping that be at its best, even if we know we want to make it better? And so the reason that's a strength-based approach is that we help the group to co-inquire into what's giving life to our operations, our customer service, our patient care, our speed of new product development, whatever it might be. What's helping us be at our best at that? That suggests what our collective strengths are. And then how do we leverage those strengths to create what we want to create in the future? And the interesting thing that we've discovered and verified is that when you help people reconnect with shared strengths through real stories and real information that they share from their experiences, when they're reconnected to their strengths, they immediately see the future differently. They see more possibility, and they see broader or more stretch options. So, the same group, if you were bringing them into blue sky strategy for the next 3 years or something, the very same people, if you first help them get reconnected with shared strengths around moments or times or projects where they've been at their best, they will generate a totally different set of future ideas. Same intellect, same experience or mix of experience. So we found this strength-based approach, I think, to be novel, much more relevant to change issues that involve culture, engagement, collaboration, cross-functional or cross-silo linkages and coordination. We still have a plethora of tools to help us with operational improvement, Six Sigma, Lean, those kinds of continuous process improvement are very relevant for certain kinds of issues. But most of the changes that organizations today are struggling with, how do we engage our employees? How do we deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we innovate quicker? And how do we adapt to the changing circumstances that seem more changing or more unpredictable than ever before? those kinds of issues, this approach seems to really hit a sweet spot. And it's scalable, which means that it potentially gives us a way to convene very large numbers of stakeholders, communities, entire supply chains, governments perhaps. It gives us a hope of a way to bring those people together to make common sense, so that we don't have to rely on smaller groups only or hierarchies of groups where one group still has privilege and information that other groups don't have. So I guess in short, what it is a method to help stakeholders inquire together to discover shared strengths, imagine future possibilities, and then co-create actual changes or scenarios to get to those ideal images.
All right. And I mean, just staying with you, Ron, for a moment, I mean, it just seems like, given everything that's transpired in the world in the last couple of years, the utility and applicability of appreciative inquiry is probably more salient for many people than it's ever been. Yourself and David Cooperrider, you published an article in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science entitled Appreciative Inquiry in a Pandemic, an Improbable Pairing. This was originally published in, I think, the fall of 2020, a time when I think basically the whole world, in addition to their own local troubles with COVID, were kind of looking on absolutely aghast at the American experience of this pandemic in particular. And at the beginning of the article, yourself and Coop lead off with this beautiful exhortation, this optimistic call to arms, which reads, quote, "Let us recognize that it is in times of disruption the best in human systems can burst forth." You then conclude the paper by stating that appreciative inquiry argues that we change best when we are strongest, and as human beings we can change best and in the most capacity-filled ways when we experience the combined power of every relevant resource, even the tiniest seed of hope. Now, I think at this point, my professional Rolodex is an even split between people who would largely or totally agree with both of these sentiments on the one hand, that the disruption of COVID has brought out the best in us and that those seeds of hope are many and evident. And on the other hand, I've also spoken to a lot of people who've taken a much less sanguine position and who have basically said that COVID has revealed humanity's stark limitations and its capacity to get things completely wrong, far more than it has revealed our encouraging possibilities or our ability to successfully navigate such massive disruption. So some 1.5 years hence from the publication of that paper, I want to know if you think that the global experience of COVID has vindicated the position yourself and Coop took in that paper, or whether the way things have transpired with this disease and this pandemic have given you pause or perhaps even a shift in perspective on this issue, especially as it relates to the utility and applicability of appreciative inquiry.
It has not weakened or changed my or David's perspective on that at all. The argument wasn't that only the best in humanity or the best in individual strength, capacity, resilience shows up. The argument is, I'll take your Rolodex, both entries in that Rolodex, both halves, see a certain reality, or they see a certain they see both. They see both. And nobody would deny that there aren't examples of people like first-line caregivers exposing extraordinary resilience. And nobody would deny that there's been huge breakdowns in coordination, organization, implementation of, the distribution of masks and et cetera. The question is, what do we choose to look at next? What do we choose to ask questions about? What do we choose to change or improve? That's the key choice point. What we believe in the appreciative inquiry approach and the theory behind it is that human systems move in the direction of what they most frequently ask questions about. Seriously ask and study. So if we're going to study more and more of the breakdowns, history shows we'll never get past them. You don't get good and great by studying bad, ever. You get less bad, but you never get good and great by studying bad. If you want good and great, then you study the examples of good and great that are in front of you. If we want post-traumatic growth, which it's estimated 60 to 70% of adults experience naturally, then we study that more. Should we study post-traumatic stress syndrome? Of course. It's a disorder that's harmful. We should study it. But if we're studying that more, or if we're denying the importance or the relevance of post-traumatic growth, then we're going to see less and less growth. So it's not appreciative inquiry isn't suggesting that only human strengths and goodness show up. What it's suggesting is there's always something that's life-giving. And so if we choose to look into that, it will in fact grow. I think Viktor Frankl, as an example, was an appreciative inquirer. Of course, not the jargon and not the management jargon that goes along with that. But when he writes about his experience and how he survived the camps in the Holocaust, in addition to pure luck, just not being pushed into a certain line each day, what he talks about is looking around and realizing he has a choice every moment between the stimulus he perceives and his response. He has a choice. He can look for what's life-giving, or he can look at the opposite. And that his stories just, they're incredible in terms of how they evidence that him living that idea, that he can choose what to look for. And he finds things even in those circumstances that are life-giving.
All right. Well, I best admonish the folks in that other half of my Rolodex that if they do over-focus on the fact that, or the idea that we're going to disadapt ourselves out of existence, we probably are going to condemn ourselves to disadapting ourselves out of existence. So I'll tell them to be fairly warned. I'll move it over to you now, Udayan. You co-authored a fascinating paper in Consulting Psychology Journal with Daniel Goleman, who many people will know as the forefather of emotional intelligence, along with our inimitable friend Richard Boyatzis, who's also done a ton of work in the same space. And the paper was a validation of a measure called the Personal Sustainability Index. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this measure, what you perceive to be its major value, and perhaps particularly its major value for the times we're currently living in now.
Absolutely. In fact, listening to Ron, I realized that a lot of the work that we do in appreciative inquiry and positive psychology at the level of teams and groups also apply at the individual level. And those same principles of positive psychology are also very applicable for people in their own personal lives. So a lot of our work in this particular research that you mentioned really came out of a frustration that when it comes to the general field of stress management, the focus almost entirely has traditionally been on mitigating the stressors in our life, right? And similar to what Ron mentioned, there has been relatively little focus on things that renew us personally. So a lot of focus on the negative and almost zero focus on the positive. And in recent years, there's a lot of research in neuroscience that shows that individuals kind of are driven by primarily two neural networks. One is the default mode network, where individuals are kind of, they're able to open up to new ideas. They're able to emotionally connect with people. They're able to be more conducive to the environment around them. And then there is the task positive network, where it's really more about focusing on a particular small area and then getting things done. So it's more of an analytical network, an analytical mode of operating. And what happens is when we are undergoing some stressful activity, our body, our neural system activates the task positive network. So when we do research that focuses on reduction of stressful activities, what we're really doing is we are mitigating the effect or the negative impact of that stressful activity. We are kind of losing out on everything that comes with the activation of the other part, which is the default mode network, right? And we started thinking about, so what is it that activates that positive network? What is it that helps people renew? What is it that helps people connect to other people around them? What is it that helps people open up to the environment that is around them? And based on our research in the psychology literature and social science literature, also a little bit in management literature, we came up with a whole bunch of activities that are actually not just stress mitigating, but are actually renewing to the individual. So things like, and these are very simple things, and there's been a lot of research in psychology that management researchers have ignored so far. Simple things like taking a walk in nature, or spending a few moments with your spouse or your partner, which is very stress-free, which is not related to all the domestic work that you kind of focus on often with your spouses or partners, but just those playful moments with your spouse or partner or with your family members. Other simple things like playing with your pet, for example, or playing with a child. So there are so many things that renew us at an emotional, psychological, social level. And if we limit our research on stress management to only reducing the stressors, that is just half the story. We are not looking at the positive side of it. So what we did was we compiled a list of a lot of these activities that are very possible for people to do in their daily lives. It's something that people can easily take time out for. And then this index kind of compiles a lot of these activities and compares it to, again, stressors. So it's not like we are ignoring the things that are causing stress, but we are creating a measurement that balances the two. So this index or this measurement creates a score out of our daily routine and activities, and then creates or gives us a sense of what kind of a balance we are creating between stressors and renewal activities. And this particular study was not just about creating a score, it goes to the next level. What we really showed was that, of course, those renewal activities are important for psychological well-being and better psychological functioning in our daily lives. But there was another interesting finding, which was that it's not just the number of renewal activities that we indulge ourselves in that is related to these positive outcomes, but it's also the variety of it, which basically means that if we only have 1 hour in our day to spare, then instead of slogging out that 1 hour in the gym, can we spend 15 minutes going out for a walk, 15 minutes playing with a pet, 15 minutes doing something else, so on and so forth. So it's not just doing something that is renewing, but also trying to do as many different kinds of things that are renewing to us personally that has a long-term impact on our well-being.
It's so cool that you've been able to come up with this measure that has such, or could have such tremendous practical value, especially those two things that you've just mentioned there. It's not just that you're engaging in renewal activities, but the breadth and variety of them is also important. And also the point that you just made about, we've typically conceived of stress management as just getting back to baseline, and what you guys have sort of, very, very persuasively argued in the paper is, it's all about going a step beyond. It's not enough just to, de-stress yourself back to a healthy baseline. You want to keep going and get yourself to a point of renewal. I think that's a very, very important implication that came out of that paper. I'll stay with you, Udayan, for just a moment. You also, you recently published a paper in the Leadership and Organization Development Journal entitled Managerial Coaching, a Paradox-Based View. And it's great that we have Ron here, given all that he's also written about the nature of paradox itself. But could you outline what your main conclusions were in this research and what you consider to be its practical takeaways for leaders trying to navigate the challenges and complexities of modern leadership?
Absolutely. And in fact, as you rightly mentioned, it was in Ron's PhD module that I was first introduced to paradox theory, with, of course, Smithenberg's classic text around the paradoxes of group life. But because I have been involved very closely with the research around coaching and leadership coaching in our department, also at the Coaching Research Lab, I have always kind of tried to integrate these different theories that help us take a different perspective at those phenomena that we study, maybe from a theory that is not related to some of the other theories in the organizational behavior literature. So, for example, when we're looking at coaching and leadership development, of course, we look at it from some of the traditional identity development theories. But when you also look at the practice or the reality of coaching in our organizations, the reality is, as you're aware, that we don't always have an external coach or an executive coach coming in. Often it's the leader, the team leader, or the manager, or the supervisor who is providing the coaching. And it doesn't have to be in a formal role. It could also be happening very informally. So then the question is, do these traditional theories of leadership development apply in that scenario? Because here in this case, the leader or the coach is not just a coach. The coach is also somebody who's responsible for the person's performance, right? For getting certain organizational outcomes in the organizational context. So essentially, it's a coach who's wearing two hats. One is the hat of the coach, of course, and then the other hat is that of a manager or a supervisor. So in that case, there are certain tensions that are emergent in that relationship. And in my paper, I look at these tensions from the perspective of the team member. So again, a lot of research in coaching talks about coaching at a relational level or in terms of what the coach offers. But how does the coachee receive that coaching intervention, especially in the complex context of an organization, when the coach is your manager as well? So kind of reviewing a lot of the literature around tensions and paradoxes in organizational life, and then also bringing it together with leadership development, career coaching, and the research around that, and reviewing research that has happened in these fields over the last 10, 15, 20 years. In this paper, I distilled 4 major pairs of tensions that are possible in a context where the coach is your manager. And just to sort of give a quick example of what some of these tensions are. So one of them, I say, is a tension between change and continuity. So very simply, this means that as a team member, often my ability or my desire for change may not be actually consistent with my manager's or my organization's desire for change and continuity. So to give a very simple example, if I'm an engineer and I love my technical role, and for my manager or for my supervisor, my personal development means transitioning from my role as a technical expert into a team leader or a people manager, then there is a kind of inconsistency. And any kind of a coaching conversation, and typically we know that in organizations, these kind of coaching conversations happen when people are either transitioning or they are being sort of handheld in a transition that is about to happen. There is this push towards a new role, and it's fine to have that conversation when it's an external coach, when you have that freedom, when you have that sense of psychological security that you can talk about your inhibitions regarding the upcoming change. But in a lot of cases, when it's a manager who's also responsible for, let's say, your performance evaluation at the end of the year, depending on how well you can transition into this role, that can create this tension between change and continuity. So in a similar vein, I talk about other tensions that happen. There is the tension between autonomy and structure, which means that there's this desire to be free as an individual, but there's also this structured context within which I operate and within which the coaching happens. There is the tension between short and long-term orientations, again, that is very prevalent in these kind of relationships. And of course, there is the tension between authenticity and social influence, where as a participant in the coaching relationship, I'm trying to be as authentic to my own self as possible, but there is also this social influence that's coming from the team, but kind of exemplified by how my team manager or my team leader leads that coaching conversation. So the essence of this paper is that whenever we have a coaching or a managerial coaching relationship, it's important to approach it without preconceived notions around traditional coaching. So not to say that a traditional coaching approach is not important or that it is not relevant, but at the same time recognize that there are all these tensions that could come up because of the very unique nature of what managerial coaching is. So any good manager who also wants to be a coach has to be aware of these tensions and then manage it effectively in that relationship itself.
That's fascinating. And that actually like mirrors so much of my professional experience as a coach working these days. I mean, I would say that, some significant percentage of my clientele are people who were technically expert professionals who got promoted into their first big managerial job. And to your point, it's fine working with me as kind of the outsider looking in. They can be free and uninhibited with me, but being able to transfer that same mindset over to working with the person they report to, that's a much greater challenge. And I think a lot of people recognize, a lot of managers would be wise to recognize those kinds of like looming challenges on the parts of the people that they are managing, and to sort of adapt their managerial coaching process and philosophy and kind. So I think that work has some really, really fascinating practical implications for managerial coaching. Ron, I'm gonna swing this back over to you for a moment, mate. As you mentioned at the top of the show, one of your other major wheelhouses as a scholar has been group dynamics and team building. I wonder, besides some of the obvious changes with respect to remote working and the like, could you comment on what you consider to be the most significant impacts that COVID has had on groups and teams working together, and what some of the practical implications of these impacts might be?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind in my own work, virtually in teams, is I think more at the obvious level. The introduction of chat, I think, has a major impact on group work in the COVID and will in the post-COVID era, if you want to say that. What I mean by that is, even if you turn off the private chat option, if you watch chat going on while there's also people in the gallery talking, it shows a couple of things. On the one hand, it gives voice to people. instead of having to wait for a pause in the conversation, or perhaps they're a little unsure about saying it aloud, but they're still willing to type something in chat. It gives voice. At the same time, it certainly evidences multitasking and divided attention. Not that that wasn't taking place in face-to-face meetings, but unless people said, we're going to collect your smartphones at the door and give them back to you after the meeting. But I think it makes it more. It just makes it more visible, more evident that it's a bigger challenge, I think, to hold attention, or it's a different challenge maybe to hold attention in a virtual meeting type of environment. So that's one thing I see. The other thing is that I think the more we work in both hybrid, face-to-face and virtual combined, or just virtual, it's going to, I think, cause us to relook at what does safety mean? What is it that produces psychological safety in a virtual context? And can you help produce it? How can you? Maybe it'll end up being the same as we do face-to-face, but I haven't. I still think psychological safety is critical to groups and team performance. But I don't have the answer here. It's just a question that I don't think it's the same in virtual or in a virtual modality. It was interesting that one of the largest and most recent studies of teams just wrapped up before the pandemic. Google's Project Aristotle. I think they studied over 270 plus teams in their organization. And being Google, they collected all kinds of data. They mined the data for months and basically came up with two factors, differentiated the high-performing and most effective teams from the lower and least effective. One was psychological safety, and the other was balanced participation. IQ, experience, gender mix, all these other factors didn't explain hardly anything significantly in terms of difference, but psychological safety and balanced participation, not equal, but spread participation, voice, people having voice. So I think those are important lessons, and I think that the safety one is the one that's put in question now with the more virtual work that we do. There was a belief before the pandemic, at least my assessment of the research was that the best virtual groups did find ways to be face-to-face on occasion, that they were not totally virtual. And I think that's a question worth revisiting and examining again now that we've had so much, as you suggested, forced experience with totally virtual groups.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Sorry, go on.
Just add one more, Gareth. I actually, when I thought of this, it took me back to a very old concept, a very dated concept called Theory X and Theory Y. Very generally being, there are two sets of assumptions that were associated with managerial or leadership styles. And the X set of assumptions, people are transactional like boxes. There's an input and an output. They're inherently lazy unless you can find ways to motivate them, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Theory Y assumptions were just the opposite, that people have an inherent desire to learn. Everybody has growth potential. Motivation is intrinsic. It's not from extrinsic means. I think that the forced virtualness has awakened a lot of managers to the fact that their people exhibit more of the Y assumptions than the X assumptions. I'm sure that the biggest fear of a lot of leaders when they saw the writing on the wall that people were going to have to work remotely is that productivity was going to go down, that people would not spend the kind of hours or attention that they would have expected if they were, quote, in the building, in the office. And just the opposite took place. In many cases, productivity went up. It did not suffer in many cases if it wasn't due to lack of resources, supplies people needed or things like that. So I think at a very deep level, the whole pandemic has kind of evidenced for a lot of people that assumptions they were making about their own employees might have been wrong, just wrong. Yeah.
It's all very, very interesting. I just from my own experience, I have just returned. I say returned. I've just begun in-person teaching after starting my job as a professor in management and leadership here in Vietnam. Teaching the entire time virtually, and just and only returning to in-person teaching in the last couple of weeks. And a couple of things that have sprung to mind is one, I think to your point, all the fears about productivity possibly going down were horribly misplaced, at least in the case of my students. I think in many ways they were more productive during their time working exclusively online. But to the point about psychological safety, I think for some of my students, there was there has been a very, very fine line between psychological safety and psychological fragility that comes from working exclusively online. And I think that's been evidenced by the return to in-person teaching, that basically all of the, let's call them comforts or the consistencies of, working from home, having your own setup and all that kind of thing, like being around what you're used to and being accustomed to that for so long, having to then make that pivot to, okay, now I have to report to a classroom. I have to be in the presence of other people. Even for socially confident, extroverted, outgoing students of mine, that has been a real challenge. And I think that has been a real adjustment. And I think that for all the psychological safety that learning online had provided, for some of them it almost provided too much. It almost provided too much of like an ensconcing effect, by which the return to in-person learning was like a stark nosedive back into reality. So it's going to be interesting to see. Now that here in Vietnam, the government has sort of committed to the idea that no matter how much the cases are going to continue ticking up or how much COVID there is in the community, we're going to ride this out now. We're committed to the idea of it's back to in-person teaching, and we're not going back to this exclusive online model. So it'd be very interesting to see how it pans out across the world. But let's make a shift here to your combined collaborative work. You both gave a talk at the Academy of Management conference last year about the benefits and perceptions of companies practicing triple bottom line innovation, which Udayan, you sort of mentioned at the top of the show a little bit, alluded to a little bit at the top of the show. And in the abstract of the presentation's proceedings, you concluded that, quote, when leaders and organizations are socially and ecologically embedded and take a long-term view of the business, it inspires innovations that prioritize positive impact. Could you both tell us a little bit about the nature of triple bottom line innovation and what both organizations and society stand to gain when companies do adopt this approach to practicing business?
Sure. The the premise of that particular study and some other studies is the background is this idea or this proposition that businesses can be, and some people might argue should be, but that businesses can be positive agents of world benefit, not just shareholder benefit. So the idea behind this proposition is that you can do well economically by doing good. And doing good means doing good for society, for the environment, whether it's at the level of community, supply chain, employability of people. It can vary, but if you take something like the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, they give you a broad domain of ways that you can do social and or environmental good. And so the triple bottom line is just one framing of that orientation, that if a business embeds this doing good for others into its business strategy, it can actually not just make a profit, but actually make a better profit, do well for themselves by doing good. And I'll let Udayan sort of maybe share some examples if he wishes, but the embodiment idea in that quote that you read, I think the interesting discovery there is that organizations don't shift or transform or move in this direction simply by kind of a cognitive activity that says, okay, this strategy makes sense, let's pursue it. That what we've found in collecting thousands of stories now of these kinds of business innovations, what this is, this embodiment idea, that the leader, it's not just a kind of a mental decision that they then get behind in good leadership and excite people and draw them, that they themselves have some kind of life experience that that we call embodies them, whether it's environmentally or socially. That their connection to this idea is personal, not just organizational. Udayan, you want to build on that or give some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ron explained the premise and the basic structure of our study very well. So I just wanted to touch upon a couple of things that I personally found very interesting. There's this whole conversation in the sustainability management area, or in the business for positive impact area, that talks about can business be can businesses do good and also make profits, or do businesses have to do some harm in order to make enough profits? And the answer is yes and yes. And the reason is simply that there is possibility for both. What is really important is that what is the level of intentionality behind the kind of innovations and the business practices that are implemented. And this is where the role of the leader becomes very important. This is where the role of the organization and management, senior management, becomes very important. So, for example, in a lot of these cases, we saw that the leadership, or at least individual leaders, came from contexts that were very, what we call, socially and ecologically embedded, which means that they are rooted to the land. They are part of the local communities. So, for example, we talked about a company in the local Cleveland area where the person who started off this organization comes from the local community, and they built a team which really brought together a lot of local people and local farmers, and the restaurant and the food industry that she was part of was really benefiting the area that she was operating in and where she came from. So this kind of shows us that, this sort of shows us the contrast between examples where people are very ecologically, socially embedded within their context versus, let's say, the stereotypical image of a Wall Street banker totally far removed from the people who are impacted by the decisions that they make. So not to say that somebody on Wall Street has to necessarily make bad decisions for the environment and for the communities, but it's very clear that having some sort of an experience and some sort of an embeddedness, as we say, in the local communities, in the environment, in society, is important in developing leaders and developing organizations that give back to those communities and to those societies. And it also helps individuals and groups develop what we call a long-term orientation. So looking at not just quarterly profits, but also the long-term impact of business operations. That becomes all the more likely when you have leaders that are connected to the society and to the communities that are impacted most by the business decisions that these organizations make.
Yeah, and again, just, I mean, as with all of both of your work, I mean, just such tremendous takeaway practical value from all of this, so much that businesses can learn, fold into their repertoire, and apply, to, like you've said, towards business being an agent of world benefit. I mean, it really, really does, it really does come down to that, like, what are your intentions for your business in the world? What is your philosophy of business predicated on in the world? It just seems to me like that the time of the wall, the stereotypical Wall Street greed is good and all the rest of it, that sort of single-minded neoliberal approach, is not only, dinosaur level outdated, but stupidly impractical and ill-advised, and just could not be purposed towards anything of real good in the world. And especially when, you consider the alternatives out there, when you consider that you could actually be a business that makes, an ecological focus or a philanthropic focus, or even just some sort of socially conscious or socially minded focus, when those alternatives are not only available, but can make your business better and more profitable, and you get the added bonus of doing something really good and positively impactful in the world. It's like, why would we ever consider returning to these, old business models of yore, these hyper-capitalistic, business models of yesteryear? But guys, we are almost out of time today, so I just want to wrap things up just by just asking you both. You're both at what I guess you could say are relatively opposite ends of your professional academic careers. Ron, you've been in the game for a while now, and Udayan, you're probably just starting to really begin hitting your straps now as an emerging scholar, despite the fact that you've already been responsible for such great, I think, quite groundbreaking research. But Ron, I'll ask you first. Given all you've experienced, discussed, published, taught in your career, what continues to pique your interest or stimulate your curiosity as an academic?
Well, a couple of things. Pragmatically, the joy of being with Udayan, yourself, when you were here, that's a real gift, and it is, it stimulates not just the brain, but it keeps curiosity alive to have the privilege to work with young people entering academia, entering applied research and things like that. Some of the things that interest me today, carrying on from the business as agent of world benefit, is the idea of, we call it mirror flourishing, that not only can businesses do better economically by doing good, but the members of the organization, when they focus on how can we do good out there, whatever out there means, community, nature, supply chain, employment, etc., they in fact translate that themselves into internal collaboration, creativity, innovation, work effort, citizenship behavior, etc. All these good outcomes. So there's at least a potential idea here that there's something operating, and in neuroscience they're actually calling it mirror neurons. And it's a fairly new area of neuroscience, but it's this image transfer. Seeing good and being a part of doing good out there somehow translates into me wanting to do more good here in my job, in my team, in my department. So that's a very interesting. And the other one for me is I'm one. I don't know if there's a whole lot of us who believe that the pandemic has actually not changed our environments. The environment that most organizations live in, had been living in prior to the pandemic, was also volatile, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous. That VUCA acronym that's getting popularity right now. I think those conditions were there before the pandemic. The pandemic has put a spotlight on it and kind of pushed us into, adapting and coping and so forth. But our theories and our notions about human organization are not based, or let me say, they're not synchronous with emergence and complexity and uncertainty. Most organization science is about eliminating uncertainty, reducing it. And what if we need to live in it? What if it's not going to ever get less certain? More certain. It's only going to get less uncertain. That interests me. How can we help people live with emergence rather than predicted performance or predicted patterns, that kind of thing. And lastly, my time with my grandsons makes me very curious about generativity. What does it mean? What creates generative connections? Because I feel it. I don't think I understand it fully.
And we're going to be relying on your grandkids and their generation to be navigating this complexity, this so-called right. VUCA era. I'm with you though that I feel that the VUCA era has gone on. Like there was no definitive starting point for this so-called VUCA era, and yet people talk about it as if it's a relatively recent development. I mean, that complexity and that uncertainty was already there. And to your point, I think COVID has amplified it. It's brought it front and center in many people's minds. But that complexity was always there. And I think that, there's going to be, and I don't want to sound like the pessimist here, but there's a very high likelihood of infectious disease experts and epidemiologists are to be believed that COVID-23 or COVID-25 could be around the corner. If it's not that, it's artificial intelligence or it's climate change or some natural disaster or an asteroid. Again, I'm just throwing out all the cynical possibilities here, but that VUCA time, this epoch of VUCA has been going for a long time, and I think it's going to continue for many, many more years and generations to come. And Udayan, yourself, what are you looking forward to? I mean, now that you've got such a long and promising scholarly career still ahead of you, what kind of areas are you most interested in pursuing in your research and your scholarship?
Right. I think a lot of my research so far, especially in my dissertation, has been at the individual level. So how do people change? How do people develop? How do people grow? And I'm getting increasingly interested in the organizational context within which people learn and develop and grow. So I think a lot of our work around leadership development or career development is sometimes decontextualized. And I think kind of bringing the organization and the team back into individual growth and leadership growth, that's something I'm very interested in. So increasingly, or if I'm looking at the future research that I'm most interested in, I'm looking at what are the kind of teams, what are the kind of organizational cultures that are most conducive to individual level development and growth in the long term. So not just focusing on the person, but focusing on organizations as a whole, focusing on teams, and looking at all of these things like coaching. How can they be integrated better? So I'm looking forward to doing more research around the context within which people learn and change and grow, and not just the person himself or herself.
Well, I obviously goes without saying, I wish you all the very best with all of that. I mean, if your publication track record already is any precedent, I think, your best work is probably still ahead of you. So just like wishing you all the best fortune in the world with that. And guys, that brings us to the end of the conversation. It's been fun. It's been fascinating. It's been so great to see you both again and hear what you've been up to and what you've been thinking about. I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate you being here. And hopefully we can do this or something like this again sometime soon, maybe when the world has return to some semblance of normality. I suspect maybe just to the point I made before, maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe it's all going to be volatility and uncertainty and abnormality from here on out. But let's cross our fingers and hope for otherwise. But regardless, so great to see you both, and thanks for joining me today.
Likewise, Gareth. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth.
All right, cheers, guys.
And it got me thinking.